Hello and welcome to the video. Today I'm going to take you through my top 5 exercises for you to grow your hamstrings. Now, before I start, there are a few things that I need to say. The first thing is that with many great leg exercises in particular, they target multiple muscle groups. So, for example, the classic barbell back squat, an amazing leg developer which will help you grow your hamstrings. It also heavily involves the quads, the glutes, the calves. It even involves the upper back. You need to have a stable upper back for the bar to rest on. You need a strong lower back to make sure you don't cave forward. You need a strong core and to brace properly, again, so you don't cave forward. And there are many other stabilizing muscles that are involved. So, if you are going to train your legs all together on like a lower or a leg day, I highly recommend doing large compound lifts like the barbell back squat in order to help you develop your hamstrings and the rest of your leg muscles. The list today will not include any large compound lifts like that. These are just hamstring isolation exercises. If you are going to train your legs all together on a lower day, I would recommend starting with your large compound lift, doing your sets of that to develop your legs, and then doing isolation exercises for each of the quads, glutes, hamstrings and calves. And you could use the exercises on this list today to help you develop your hamstrings and target them in particular. I'll also say that the glutes in particular are heavily involved in many movements with the hamstrings. That is because the glutes and the hamstrings help to do the same joint action at the hip, which is hip extension. Anytime you sort of bent over and you're extending your back up, your glutes are contracting and your hamstrings are contracting. They're doing the same role. So anytime you do hip extension, even though it's sort of a hamstring isolation exercise, it'll involve the glutes, and the same way round. It isolates the glutes and the hamstrings from other muscles, but they are both working together. So I would definitely recommend training the hamstrings in addition with glutes, at least in a session, because they're so linked, even if you don't want to train all of your legs in conjunction in that session. But my main recommendation would be to do a full lower day and train all of your quads, hamstring, glutes and calves together so that you can do those large compound exercises and then the isolation exercises that I'm going to show you today. And finally, just before I start, as always, there are 4 things that I'm looking for from an exercise when determining how good it is for training a muscle. How much of a stretch the muscle gets during the exercise, how much of a contraction the muscle gets, how isolated the muscle is, and how heavy you can load the muscle. Of those factors, I prioritize isolation because if you fully isolate a muscle, it has all of the tension placed upon it and it has to do all of the work to move the weight. That means that it must respond to that training stimulus and improve. That is just my opinion. If you'll hear many other different things within the fitness space. Some people will prioritize load. They'll say lift big weights to get big muscles. They might prioritize the stretch or the contraction or lengthen partials. Whatever modality they choose, I prefer isolation because if you fully isolate a muscle, it has to be the one doing all of the work and it has to improve. As you progressively overload that exercise, you know that it is that muscle that is getting stronger and improving. That is just my opinion though. As with everything today and all of these exercises, feel free to disagree with me down in the comments, and if you think that there's a better hamstring exercise, do comment it down below. So without further ado, let's get to it. So, coming in spot number 5 are Nordic curls. The main advantage of Nordic curls is that you isolate the hamstrings very well and you place a crazy amount of tension on the hamstrings throughout the entire range of motion. The reason you isolate the hamstrings so well is the hamstrings basically insert over the knee joint and the hip joint and are responsible for 2 joint actions. One of them is bending the knee in, and the other one is extending the hip, like I said in the intro. Nordic curls focus on that bending the knee in. You're bending your entire body weight up, and that is why you get such a great load on the hamstrings during that range of motion, because you are using your entire body from your knees up weight as resistance. That does mean that that is both a positive and a negative of Nordics. The positive is that because you're using a lot of weight relative to the hamstrings, they are doing a lot of work and it provides a great heavy load and training stimulus on the hamstrings. The weakness of it is, unfortunately, Nordic curls are very hard to do, and there are very few people who can do them unassisted. However, fear not, because banded Nordics are even better than Nordics, assisted banding Nordics. So the main advantage is that it will help assist you so that you can actually do the exercise and do the Nordics. But the way that it provides the assistance is the reason that I find banded Nordics better than regular Nordics. So when you are doing a Nordic curl, at the bottom, that is the hardest part. That is because your hamstring's in a stretch position, so it's difficult to contract, and your body is leaning all the way over, and the moment arm on your hamstring and about your knee is very long and very heavy, versus when you're at the top, your weight's basically just grounding down through your body and you're just kneeling. Not a lot of pressure is being placed on the hamstrings, and it's quite easy. Because of that, I do actually recommend not going all the way to the top. I'd go most of the way up, keep the tension on the hamstrings, and then go back when performing Nordic curls. But coming back to the band tension, at that bottom point where you are your weakest, the band is stretched the most and it's providing the most assistance. And then at the top where you're stronger, the band provides less assistance. So the band helps flatten that strength curve, and it assists you more where you need more assistance, and it assists you less where you need less assistance. That means that your hamstring is going through a more constant amount of tension, a more constant amount of difficulty, and you are providing a more constant stimulus throughout the entire range of motion, which is fantastic because then the movement is challenging the whole way through rather than being impossible at the bottom where you basically can't do the exercise, and then very easy at the top. Unfortunately, Nordic curls do not get a great stretch on the hamstring. That is because everybody probably knows how to stretch your hamstring. It is when the knee is straight and you lean forward and stretch your hamstrings. Obviously, a Nordic curl does not go through that range of motion and doesn't stretch the hamstring very well. However, that is not a problem because many of the other exercises do hit the hamstring in a stretch position, and my advice would be simply to do Nordics in conjunction with another exercise that does provide a great stretch on the hamstring, like the exercise which is next up. So overall, I find Nordic curls a fantastic exercise for developing your hamstrings. And coming in spot number 4 are RDLs. Now, the main advantage of RDLs is that you get a fantastic stretch on the hamstrings using a great load. You should be able to load this exercise about 30 to 40% of your 1 rep max deadlift, which is a heavy and substantial load to use for the hamstrings. Now, in order to get that great stretch, you have to do the right technique. If you do the wrong technique and just think of leaning forward from the top, there are 2 massive issues with this. The first one is that as you lean forward, all of your weight will go into the balls of your heels, and you'll not be able to go all the way down or use a heavy weight, otherwise you'll feel like you're going to fall over. Logistically, it doesn't work. And the second issue is that you basically don't get that great stretch on the hamstrings. In order to do that, what you need to do is from the top, send your hips backwards, arch your back to really accentuate the stretch on the hamstring, and let the bar lower vertically down and go all the way. You'll start to feel your hamstrings really stretch, particularly because of the load from the weight, and go all the way until you feel like you hit a wall. There should be a point before the bar hits the floor where your hamstrings under that load feel like you can't go any further without sort of rounding your back. Don't round your back, just go to that position. That is fantastic. That's your bottom position, and then come back up to the top. Now, I wouldn't go all the way to the top for 2 reasons. The first one is, as I said in the intro, the glutes are also heavily involved in hip extension, and you will shift the tension away from the hamstrings at the top and more onto the glutes. The glutes are primarily responsible for bringing the hips back through and locking, extending your hips out fully. So what I would advise is going almost to the top, keeping the tension on the hamstrings, and then going back down. And the second reason is because you don't get a good contraction at the top anyway during this exercise. The most contracted form of the hamstrings in this exercise is when you're standing at the top. And as you stand regularly in normal life, you don't think, oh, I'm getting a great contraction on my hamstrings. You are just standing. The best way to contract the hamstring is to bend the knee back, which this exercise doesn't do. However, that is not an issue because, like I said with Nordic curls, just pair it with an exercise that addresses that weakness. So I would pair RDLs, which don't get a great contraction on the hamstring, with an exercise that does, like Nordic curls. And that works out quite well because Nordic curls don't get a good stretch on the hamstring and RDLs do. Now, before I move on, I will address quickly that RDLs are not the same thing as stiff leg deadlifts. Many people confuse these, probably because people have posted videos and just used the terms interchangeably, but they're not the same thing. Even 2023 World's Strongest Man Mitch Hooper admitted that he didn't know what the difference was. Well, Mitch, obviously you're watching this video, here you go. Stiff-legged deadlifts are basically a deadlift variation in that you start with the bar on the floor, you set up like in a normal conventional deadlift, you grab the bar, you set your hips in place and your knees at a slightly bent angle, and you keep your legs stiff throughout the entire movement and you pull the bar up to lock out. It is basically a strength accessory working on your hip and back extension. It's isolating that by not bending the knees at all during the exercise. That is for training strength. I would use stiff leg deadlifts. RDLs, however, I'd start with them in the rack. Walk backwards, and they're about sending those hips backwards and getting a great stretch on the hamstring. They are more of a hamstring isolation exercise. They're actually doing the same action from the hips down as a good morning. The only difference is instead of the bar being on your back, like it is with good mornings, you're just hanging it down below and you're doing the same thing. That's actually why I chose RDLs over good mornings, because when you have the bar on your back, it places more tension on your back as you lean forwards, your lower back has to do more work, and with good mornings, as you go all the way down, the bar just seems to roll off your head and it's very uncomfortable. Any clients I've tried to teach good mornings to, they run into the same issue, and so do I. The bar ends up rolling off your head and feeling like it's crushing it. That is why I pick RDLs over good mornings. However, if you do like good mornings, they're basically doing the same job as RDLs, so you can use them interchangeably. Overall, I find RDLs an amazing exercise for providing a great stretch on the hamstring, and they will definitely help you blow up your hamstrings. And coming in spot number 3 are hip extensions. Literally doing the hip extension joint action that the hamstrings are partly responsible for. Now, there are 2 main advantages to hip extensions. The first one is that you experience a great stretch on the hamstrings during the movement, and the second one is that you experience a good load on the hamstrings. You won't physically hold a large weight, but because of the biomechanics and leverages during the exercise, you will provide a high load to the hamstring. Similar to Nordic curls, you're not actually holding any weight, or you might be doing it assisted, and you will still provide a large load to the hamstrings because of the leverages of the exercise. Now, of course, the main weakness of this exercise is that you don't isolate the hamstrings fully. The glutes are heavily involved with hip extension. That's why I'd actually recommend training glutes and hamstrings together, so you could just do an exercise like this and hit them both. But if you're wanting to isolate your hamstrings more, there are 2 things that you can do. The first thing is that you can keep your back straight or even slightly arched to help accentuate the stretch on the hamstrings, and that will help you feel the hamstrings more. They should fatigue first and basically isolate the hamstrings more. The second thing you can do is actually when you place your feet in the foot plate, you can make sure that your feet are in parallel. This won't affect the hamstrings during the movement directly, but what it will do is reduce glute activation. So if you were to turn your feet outwards and lock your hips out, your glutes are contracted way more. Turning your feet out helps isolate the glutes more during this exercise. So if you were wanting to hit glutes, you could do that, but as you're trying to isolate the hamstrings, what you can actually do is keep your feet in parallel, and that will help isolate the hamstrings more, not directly through placing more load on the hamstrings, but by preventing you from placing more load on the glutes. And finally, of course, with this exercise, you don't get a good contraction on the hamstrings at all. The legs are kept straight throughout the entire movement. However, just like with the first two exercises, which had their own weaknesses, it doesn't matter. Just find an exercise that also has a good contraction on the hamstrings, like the Nordic curls, and pair it with that. Overall, hip extensions are a fantastic exercise and are very useful for helping you to develop big hamstrings. And coming in spot number 2 are GHDs or GHRs, whatever you'd like to call them, glute ham developers or glute ham raises. GHDs to me are an improved version of Nordics. They still have an amazing isolation on the hamstrings and they still contract the hamstrings very well through bending the knees. I wouldn't go all the way to the top, as I said, because in the Nordic portion of this video, because your weight just grounds down into your knees and you're basically removing the tension from the hamstrings. I would not go all the way up. I'd go almost all the way up and then I'd go back down, because that will help keep your hamstrings contracted. It will help keep the tension on the hamstrings, improve the time under tension on the hamstrings during the set, and really help burn your hamstrings out. But the main advantages that GHDs have over Nordics is, one, that they are easier and they have a flatter strength curve. So when doing GHDs, because of the curved pad, your leverages are different and it makes the beginning portion of the movement from when you're flat coming up much easier than with Nordics. So instead of it being impossible at the bottom, it is actually manageable with GHDs, and then you still get the contraction all the way up, which is fantastic. And another great benefit that they have over Nordics is, because the floor isn't in the way like it is with Nordics and with the Nordic board, you can actually keep going all the way down with GHDs into like the bottom position of a hip extension and get an amazing stretch on the hamstrings. You can then hip extend up and then contract up with the GHD. If you do that, this is the only exercise where you will have the knee bend and the hip extension all in one exercise, where you target and isolate the hamstrings fantastically and where you get the great stretch and contraction. The load as well is good during this exercise. GHDs are just amazing. And if you want, you can do a superset with hip extensions. So I would do full GHDs all the way down and all the way up as much as you can. And then when you're no longer strong enough to do that, I would just do hip extensions. You will be stronger doing hip extensions than doing full GHDs. So once you can't do any more, you can do hip extensions. And if you do weighted GHDs, you can do full weighted GHDs. Then when you can't do any more, do weighted hip extensions, then drop the weight and do unweighted hip extensions for a mega superset drop set, like a super drop set. That will be fantastic for providing a very long time of detention on the hamstrings, a very high intensity and workload, and that will definitely make your hamstrings grow. Overall, GHDs are a fantastic exercise for developing your hamstrings. And coming in spot number 1 are hamstring curls. Could it have been anything else? The number 1 hamstring exercise by far, because they tick all of the boxes of things I am looking for. First of all, they isolate the hamstrings very well. They are literally doing the bent knee action that the hamstring does. So you are isolating those hamstrings fantastically. You also are getting the best contraction of any exercise on the hamstring. That is because you can bend your knees as far as you can go and still have tension against it. And in that fully contracted position, you're still fighting the machine, which is trying to straighten your legs. So you get a killer contraction during hamstring curls. You also get a great stretch on hamstring curls if you're seated and your legs stretch out in front of you. Lean forward during the stretched position and that will help accentuate that stretch on the hamstrings. Or if you're on a lying hamstring curl machine, that should already have put your body in a good position where you should feel a great stretch on the hamstrings during your fully straightened knee position. And finally, The load on the hamstrings is fantastic. Objectively, it's not the highest number and weight because of something like RDLs. You'll be able to do higher, but that does not matter. Because of how much you're isolating the hamstrings, all of that tension is being placed onto the hamstrings. So you are actually providing a high load onto the hamstrings. Now, before I end, I should clarify that the real number one exercise is a mixture of exercises. This is because there is something called the law of accommodation, which means if you do the same thing over and over, you actually plateau and get worse. That is what is happening to people. If you found that you've plateaued in your training, that is probably why. The reason for this is that your body has basically adapted to the exercises that you've been doing and the training stimulus you've applied, and it no longer needs to adapt anymore. Your body is now fully capable of doing those exercises and the workouts that you're providing for it. What you need to do is change your exercises up to provide a new training stimulus to spark new gains. That is what Arnold meant when he said shock the muscle. You need to shock the muscle into adapting by changing something. Changing the exercise, changing the weight and the reps, changing your rest times, changing something, but changing the exercises is in particular, I find, the best way to do this. To help your muscle adapt to the new training stimulus. That is what muscle building is. It is an adaptation to the stress that you are placing on your muscles during the gym. So you need to keep providing new stresses onto your muscles to keep new gains from occurring. Keep new gains occurring. There we go. That is it for the video. I hope you did in fact enjoy the video. If you did, drop it a like, drop it a comment, subscribe, click the bell, all of that good stuff. There will be a link in the description to my coaching services. If you don't want to have to bother looking through the best exercises and making your own training plan and trying to stay accountable, if you want someone to just give you an optimal training plan based on your goals, your equipment, your time available, and to take the brain work out of training and to keep you accountable and on track, I am here. There's also just my phone number. You can text me or email me if you have any questions. Thank you very much for watching and have a great day.